Number 9. Cash-stealing London cops. Working with an organized crime organization based in Dubai, a group of criminals led by London police officer Kashif Mahmood and gang leader Mohsin Khan intercepted shipments of drug money traveling through England. They drove patrol cars and wore police uniforms, but instead of seizing the cash according to police protocol, they kept the cash for themselves. In addition to Khan and Mahmood, at least 4 others participated in the scheme. They communicated with one another and with their mysterious tipster in Dubai through a messaging network on their phones that they believed was encrypted. And when word came in about a large amount of drug money passing through, Mahmood would pick up an accomplice who posed as his partner. Working with Khan and 2 other suspects, they stopped couriers in their tracks and took the cash while pretending to be cops. Oftentimes, the group was stealing back money that the same gang had given to the couriers for drugs at the beginning of their run, which meant that they got a free load of drugs and didn't lose any money. The gang profited massively, seizing over £1 million, equivalent to about $1,224,000 US. Mahmood and his co-conspirators were busted in 2020 after cops saw him carrying out one of these interactions in uniform when he was on sick leave from his job. Anti-corruption investigators discovered the group's messages and other evidence, including large amounts of cash. Then, in 2021, Mahmood pleaded guilty to acquiring criminal property and misconduct in a public office, and as a result he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Khan was sentenced to 14 years, while the rest of the group members received sentences ranging between 6 and 15 years. Number 8. Paul Heth. 40-year-old Baptist minister Paul Heth was working as a police officer in Fresno, California, when he began an affair with a married woman named Nancy Gower. In the year 2000, he went to the home Nancy shared with her husband, a used car salesman named Ralph Gower. Heth, who was in uniform during the visit, would later claim that his intention was to tell Ralph about the affair he was having with his wife. But during the confrontation, Heth fatally shot Gower twice in the chest with his service weapon. Authorities charged Heth with murder, and during his trial, he argued that he shot Gower in self-defense. The jury convicted him of a reduced manslaughter charge after concluding that Heth killed the victim intentionally, but that there was an element of self-defense. Heth was sentenced to 21 years in prison. He tried to get the case thrown out, but the ruling was upheld. The former cop was released on parole in 2017 after serving 17 years behind bars. Number 7. Antonio José de Abreu Vidal Fijo. In 2015, 11 people died at the hands of military police in the Brazilian city of Fortaleza during what became known as the Curio massacre. The violence broke out following the murder of a police officer in the Curio neighborhood. Authorities said the civilian killings were carried out in retaliation for the cop's death. A local resident told the newspaper El Globo that officers had been barging into people's homes and dragging them out into the street. In the massacre's aftermath, 4 police officers were identified as suspects in the murders, and one of them, Antonio José de Abreu Vidal Fijo, fled from the police force and migrated illegally to the United States in 2019. Interpol issued an international arrest warrant for the fugitive cop, and he was finally found in 2023 in Rye, New Hampshire, where he was working as a roofer. Vidal Fijo attended his trial for the massacre killings in Brazil remotely. He was convicted of 11 murder charges, along with attempted murder and torture, and was sentenced to 275 years in prison. The former cop is now in custody of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement as he awaits deportation to Brazil, where he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars. Number 6. Mark Dial. 27-year-old Eddie Irizarry didn't even have time to follow police officers' orders to put his hands up when 2 Philadelphia cops approached him in his car one afternoon in August 2023. They ordered Irizarry to show them his hands, then fired 6 shots, killing him at the scene. The Philadelphia police initially claimed that Irizarry was pulled over for driving erratically and that he'd lunged at the cops with a knife. But body cam footage proved that he was sitting in his car at the time of the incident and that he didn't try to attack the officers. Surveillance video showed that it took about 5 seconds total for the officers to pull up, exit their vehicle, confront Irizarry and fire all 6 bullets. The officer accused of shooting Arizari, Mark Dial, was charged with murder, voluntary manslaughter, aggravated assault, simple assault, recklessly endangering another person, and official oppression. A judge dropped all charges based on a lack of evidence after concluding that Dial may have shot Arizari in self-defense. Dial's partner testified that Arizari had started raising a knife as Dial approached his car, which was parked the wrong way on a one-way street. The district attorney has refiled the charges, but the outcome of the case remains to be seen. Number 5. Dave Bernett. Trinidad Police Constable Dave Bernett was working security during a carnival festival in 2004 when he got into an altercation with a group of young men who'd repeatedly bumped into him. At some point, the disagreement became physical. Bernett pulled his gun and fired several rounds, shooting Kevin Cato and Ryan Solomon both square in the chest. Solomon survived, but Cato died from his injuries. Immediately after the shooting, Bernett told his supervisor that he'd been attacked by knife-wielding patrons. He said the two people had lunged at him with knives and that he thought he'd shot one of them. Witnesses told a different version of events, though, claiming that neither Cato nor Solomon were armed. Some even accused Bernett of bragging after he shot the young men, saying, "Yeah, I is police." Others described seeing Solomon grab hold of Bernett during the struggle, suggesting that he had at least some reason to be scared, even if it didn't automatically justify shooting the victims. Bernett went on trial for the killing in 2006. He argued that he shot the victims in self-defense, while the prosecution claimed that he resorted to deadly force over a minor confrontation. In the end, the former cop was found guilty of murder by a jury, making him the first police officer to be convicted of an on-duty murder since the country became independent in 1962. He was sentenced to death but stood by his claim that he acted in self-defense. Bernett appealed his case, and in 2011 his murder conviction was replaced with a reduced manslaughter conviction. His sentence was also reduced to 15 years of hard labor at a prison camp. But he was visibly disappointed by the ruling and was seen shaking his head and saying that he wanted a new trial. Number 4. Anthony John Sully. From 1966 to 1974, Anthony John Sully worked as a police officer just outside San Francisco in Millbrae, California. He was highly praised by his colleagues, but it was during these years that his behavior began to change. His first wife divorced him in 1969 because he'd become abusive. Toward the end of his police career, he married again, but it only lasted for 15 months before his second wife divorced him for constant physical abuse and other mistreatment. After leaving the police force, Sully started a contracting business, but during the late 70s and early 80s, he became addicted to cocaine and developed an unhealthy appetite for intimacy. To keep himself satisfied, he started hiring escorts. It was also during this time that he began to give in to his most primal urges. Over a 6-month period starting in February 1983, Sully murdered 6 people, including 5 women and 1 man. He tied up, assaulted, and strangled his first victim, 24-year-old Gloria Fravel, and mercilessly shot his second victim, 19-year-old Brenda Oakton, in the head. Sully's only male victim was a 24-year-old pimp named Michael Thomas. He also murdered Thomas's wife, 20-year-old Phyllis Melendez. Then in August 1983, Sully shot his ex-girlfriend, 22-year-old Barbara Searcy, in the head. His final murder came later that month when Sully fatally stabbed and bludgeoned 24-year-old drug dealer Catherine Barrett. Shortly after Barrett was killed, investigators found 3 victims' bodies inside large drums on Sully's property. They tied Sully to the killings using forensic evidence and charged him with 6 counts of murder. And in the end, the jury found him guilty as charged and sentenced him to death. Sully died on death row from natural causes in September 2023 at the age of 79. Number 3. David Hall Dixon. As he left his apartment building in Tacoma Park, Maryland for work early one morning in 2021, Pentagon Force Protection Agency police officer David Hall Dixon saw what appeared to be 3 young men trying to break into a car. According to the Tacoma Park Police, the suspects attempted to flee the scene in their vehicle when Dixon confronted them. Surveillance footage showed Dixon discharging several rounds at the car as it left a parking lot. 38-year-old James Johnson and 32-year-old Dominique Williams were both shot in the back, but the driver of the car, Michael Thomas, was left unscathed. He immediately drove to a nearby hospital, where Johnson and Williams were pronounced dead upon arrival. It's also important to note that all three men were unarmed at the time of the shooting. Prosecutors charged Dixon with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. According to charging documents, the 42-year-old cop had fired at the car as it drove away and therefore didn't present an imminent threat, which would have justified the use of deadly force. Furthermore, Dixon didn't have authority to act as a cop outside of his job, according to Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy, who accused the defendant of using his service weapon for personal reasons. Dixon's first trial ended in a hung jury, with an 11-1 deadlock in favor of convicting him of second-degree murder. Instead of going to trial for a second time, Dixon pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree assault. Under the terms of a plea agreement, he faces up to 30 years in prison at his upcoming sentencing in November 2023. Number 2. Louise Barrett Hassen. Christina Lazzarini was fatally shot in the head by her boyfriend on her 27th birthday in 1990. Her killer, Louise Barrett Hassen, was an off-duty officer for the Los Angeles Housing Authority, and before leaving the scene, he placed the gun in Christina's hand in an attempt to make her death appear self-inflicted. According to those who knew Christina, she wanted to end the relationship with Hassen, but he was determined to continue dating her. On the day of Christina's murder, Hassen pleaded with her to reconsider her decision to break up, but when she refused, he shot her dead. Hassen was found guilty of Christina's murder and was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. In 2023, after serving 26 years, he became eligible for compassionate release under a new state law that allows inmates who are seriously ill and close to dying to walk free. A judge granted compassionate release to the 78-year-old due to a terminal lung disease, and the doctors claim that he only has a year to live. Riverside County District Attorney Mike Hestron told local station KESQ that there's no indication that Hassen is actually on death's doorstep. The doctor who determined that Hassen is dying is a general practitioner, prompting the DA's office to ask the judge for permission to have an expert examine Hassen, but the court wouldn't allow it. Hestron opposed the convicted murderer's release, noting that Hassen would be cut loose without any ankle monitoring, probation, or any other supervision, leading to fears that he could re-offend. The DA further explained that the judge had instructed his office to monitor Hassen upon his release, but that they lack the proper authority to do so. Christina's family tried persuading the judge to rethink the decision to release Hassen through a petition which garnered over 3,000 signatures, but Hassen was nevertheless granted his freedom. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. John Formisano. 37-year-old Christy Solaro Formisano was shot dead on the front porch steps of her neighbor's Jefferson, New Jersey home during the summer of 2019. Inside the residence, responding police officers found Solaro Formisano's boyfriend, 40-year-old Timothy Simonson, suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. So he was rushed to the hospital and survived. The shooting was traced to Solaro Formisano's estranged husband, off-duty Newark police officer John Formisano. A few hours after being called to the crime scene, officers tracked Formisano down near his parents' home and took him into custody on suspicion of murder and attempted murder. The police-issued pistol he'd used to commit the crimes was recovered from the trunk of his car. In dashcam footage from the traffic stop, Formisano could be heard telling the arresting officers that he arrived home from work and found his wife in bed with another man. He ended up being taken to a psychiatric hospital, where he spent 9 months before being taken to jail. The case finally proceeded after Formisano was found competent to stand trial. He repeatedly rejected plea offers, which would have come with a 40-year prison sentence. Prosecutors accused Formisano of being overcome with rage when he saw his ex with her new boyfriend inside the marital home they once shared. During the trial, the court heard about how Formisano and Christy Solaro Formisano were separated when the shooting occurred. Christy had been dating Simonson for about a month when her estranged husband showed up and opened fire on the couple. She'd run from the home and was trying to seek help from a neighbor when she was killed. Formisano argued that he experienced a mental blackout when he shot the victims and that he didn't intend to kill them. But the jury was unconvinced, and Formisano was convicted as charged. He was sentenced to 79 years in prison and is required to serve at least 85% of it under state law, which means that he's guaranteed to spend at least 55 years behind bars. This means that he'd be over 100 years old before becoming eligible for parole, and that there's a strong chance that he'll never see freedom again.
8. Bizarre facial brushing. As a teenager, Nancy Morel got a pimple on her upper lip and didn't think much of it. The nurse at her school told her it was an allergic reaction to ibuprofen, but it soon took the form of a strange bruise and began to spread all over her face and body. Nancy went to the hospital, where they were unable to give her a diagnosis and told her to just keep an eye on the symptoms. The college student from Buckinghamshire, England, has travelled to numerous doctors in the 6 years since the bizarre condition first appeared. But after being misdiagnosed, having several biopsies done and consulting multiple experts, she's no closer to finding answers than she was at the beginning of her journey. At one point, she was diagnosed with a rare condition called urticarial vasculitis, which causes periodic outbreaks of hives and lesions. But doctors have since retracted the diagnosis, putting Nancy back at square one in her effort to find effective treatment. She had no underlying conditions before the bruising started, and her twin sister doesn't suffer from the unusual ailment. The bruising comes and goes in the form of flare-ups, which have become predictable. Nancy knows she's about to get a flare-up when she starts feeling nauseous and lightheaded. It's followed by facial pain, and then the bruises appear. While she lives in pain and without answers, the one positive thing is that Nancy's gotten used to looking different and says it's given her confidence. 7. The Toxic Lady. Gloria Ramirez died from cardiac arrest at a hospital in Riverside, California, while battling late-stage ovarian cancer in 1994. While taking blood samples before she passed away, hospital staff noticed strange crystals in her blood and the smell of ammonia. They also noticed a strange oily sheen on her body and a garlicky odor coming from her mouth. The employees soon began to faint, convulse, vomit, and struggle to breathe. Those who remained well enough to continue working evacuated the emergency room and treated patients in the parking lot. In the meantime, a hazmat team handled the body. They found no signs of toxic gases or any other poisonous substances that could have caused people to suddenly get sick. Altogether, 23 workers fell ill and 5 were hospitalized. One person spent 2 weeks in intensive care. The coroner discovered high levels of dimethyl sulfate, or DMSO, in Gloria's blood. Once considered a cure-all for various diseases, it was labeled dangerous in 1965. When exposed to oxygen at room temperature, DMSO turns into a highly toxic chemical called dimethyl sulfate, which can cause convulsions, delirium, paralysis, and a host of other serious symptoms. It's now suspected that Gloria used large amounts of DMSO to try treating her cancer, and that it turned into dimethyl sulfate when the hospital administered oxygen. But some disagree, including Gloria's family, who blame the hospital for her death, and the mystery remains officially unsolved. 6. Frequent fainting episodes. For 30 years, Seattle-based conservation biologist Maureen Ryan experienced frequent fainting spells when she exercised. It started in 1991 when she was in college. She passed out at a water fountain and suffered a seizure after running on a treadmill and woke up surrounded by worried members of her school's basketball team. Assuming it was a one-time thing, Ryan walked back to her dorm and continued on with her day. The next episode happened 5 years later and continued sporadically from there. Because the symptoms alleviated if she rested, Ryan simply assumed she was pushing herself too hard. At one point, doctors diagnosed her with a disorder that causes an elevated heart rate. She underwent a procedure that she was told would fix the problem. So when the fainting continued, Ryan believed it was harmless. She learned to live with it and to avoid fainting by sitting down when she noticed the first signs of an episode. In 2020, some concerning new symptoms set in, including tightness in the chest. Ryan also became winded easily while exercising, but was unable to see a cardiologist due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so she took a break from running and the fainting stopped. While running in a park one day in 2022, Ryan fainted and was unable to move or speak immediately afterward. It took her several tries before she was able to stand up, and she later told the Washington Post that she felt like she was going to die. Doctors discovered that her right coronary artery originated from the wrong location. It was something she was born with, and it was most likely causing a potentially deadly condition called aborted sudden cardiac death, which is when heart activity suddenly stops. Ryan underwent open-heart surgery to reposition the artery and endured a lengthy recovery, which came with months of cardiac rehab. She was a bit bummed after learning that it can take 3 years to feel fully normal again. But the fainting has stopped, and the experience has taught her to recognize signs that something's wrong with her body more seriously. 5. Sudden mobility loss stumps doctors. Nancy Ciancone was 46 when her fingers periodically started going numb and turning white. She was diagnosed with a relatively common condition called Raynaud's disease, which is when arteries that supply blood to the hands constrict excessively in response to the cold. Around the same time, she tested positive for lupus and began treatment, but subsequent tests turned out normal and the treatment was stopped. Ciancone's pain began to worsen and was accompanied by inflammation. She tested negative for rheumatoid arthritis, but her doctors suspected that she suffered from a rare form of the disease and put her on a medication called methotrexate. After an initial improvement, her condition worsened. In 2016, Ciancone underwent weight loss surgery. The pain spread to her hips and legs afterward, and she began to feel exhausted on a regular basis. She began cramping up when she exercised and started losing her mobility. A blood clot was ruled out, and muscle relaxants and steroids failed to provide relief. Ciancone was diagnosed with ALS in 2018, but the diagnosis was reversed a few months later. By then, her memory was starting to fail, and she was walking with a cane. Desperate for answers, she turned to the Undiagnosed Diseases Program at the National Institutes of Health, where specialists ruled out all suspected genetic causes for her condition. They discovered that she was suffering from something called adult-onset cerebral folate deficiency, which was caused by a combination of weight loss surgery and the methotrexate that she took for suspected rheumatoid arthritis. Doctors prescribed folinic acid to restore Ciancone's dangerously low folate levels. They suspected that her condition was caused by more than just weight loss surgery and methotrexate, but that folinic acid would alleviate at least some of her symptoms. In 2022, Ciancone told the Washington Post that there were still some abnormalities showing up in her tests, but that she's in a lot less pain and no longer walks with a cane. 4. New car smell causes years-long headache. After buying a new car in 2002, Tom Wells began experiencing headaches whenever he was exposed to the smell of new cars, fresh paint, and similar chemical odors. He would later tell the Washington Post that the headaches were characterized by a burning sensation at the center of his head, which he likened to the feeling of someone sandpapering his brain. Wells had no history of headaches or any medical conditions that could be linked to his symptoms. A specialist diagnosed him with a sensitivity to volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, which are gases found in the odors that bothered him. He was told to avoid being near smells that triggered his symptoms, or his headaches would become more painful and last longer. It was easier said than done, as Wells learned. A lot of products have VOCs in them, including the furniture he had to return in 2008 when he got a headache that lasted for weeks. He continued to seek second opinions and treatment, but a brain scan turned up normal, and steroids failed to alleviate his symptoms. When Wells noticed the smell of new carpet at a movie theater in Maryland one day in 2015, he decided to try to tough it out and get through the movie. It was followed by the worst headache yet, which lasted literally for years. He ended up in the ER, where a brain scan showed deep white matter lesions, which can indicate multiple sclerosis and a handful of other conditions. Wells tried several medications but experienced temporary relief at best. A doctor in the Cleveland Clinic suspected he was suffering from an obscure condition called central sensitization, which is caused by the central nervous system intensifying its pain signals to the brain. The cause is unclear, and there's no magical treatment, but an antidepressant that also treats nerve pain has led to significant improvement for Wells, who still suffers from headaches, but has gotten them to a somewhat manageable level. 3. The Plague of Athens. The Peloponnesian War began in 431 BC, following decades of rising tensions between the powerful ancient Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta. The violence was still raging the following year, when a mysterious illness befell the locals in the Athenian port of Piraeus. It was unlike anything the society had ever experienced before, and was followed by similar outbreaks elsewhere, including on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean Sea. Residents in Piraeus spread rumors that the Spartans had poisoned their wells. These beliefs were exacerbated by the fact that the disease didn't seem to affect the Spartans as badly as it plagued the Athenians. Within weeks of the initial outbreak, the plague had reached the heart of the walled city, and large numbers of people of various ages and backgrounds were falling ill. It began to spread even more rapidly after the Athenian leader Pericles relocated people from rural Attica to Athens. The plague continued for 5 years, with 2 more waves of the illness striking in 429 BC and 427 BC. Altogether, somewhere between 25 and 35% of Athens' population perished within a 5-year period. The ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who survived the illness, described suffering from a fever, redness of the eyes, inflammation of the throat and tongue, bleeding, and bad breath. These initial symptoms were followed by sneezing, hoarseness, a harsh cough, discharges of bile, ineffectual retching, diarrhea, violent spasms, and insomnia. Thucydides wrote about seeing other sufferers' skin covered in blisters and of an unquenchable thirst. Doctors didn't know how to treat the illness, and what worked for one patient seemed to harm another, according to Thucydides, who wrote that some patients died alone in their homes without a caretaker when the rest of their household left from fear of catching the disease. Most survivors never caught the sickness a second time, and when they did, it typically wasn't fatal, indicating that suffering from the illness built up some level of resistance. To this day, experts have never identified the mysterious pathogen that caused the plague. Some speculate that it could have been a form of bubonic plague, but the symptoms suggest otherwise. One study found evidence of typhoid fever in a mass grave from the time period, but critics pointed out that typhoid was common at the time and probably wasn't the source of the plague. Some researchers have noticed that the symptoms seem similar to Ebola, but proving this would be difficult because genetic evidence of Ebola is stored in RNA rather than DNA and breaks down more easily over time. If it was Ebola, there's a chance that scientists will never be able to confirm it 100%. But for now, the mystery remains unsolved. 2. Family of 5 suddenly falls ill. While working from her Washington, D.C. home in late 2020, psychologist Brooke Stroud felt so ill she had to leave a video meeting. She later told the Washington Post that she'd felt off for days, but her symptoms took a sudden turn, making her feel drugged and developing into a 100-degree fever. That same day, her 2 children developed severe headaches and started vomiting. At first, the family suspected that they were suffering from the coronavirus, but they tested negative. Weeks dragged on as their symptoms continued. Just hours after arriving home to visit for the holidays, Stroud's son became extremely ill. The same thing happened a few days later after a family friend came to stay with them. Still sick herself, she underwent extensive medical tests, which turned up no sign of anything wrong. She noticed she felt better whenever she worked in a separate building on her property, and her daughter's condition improved when she walked outside, but they always got sick again within a few hours of their symptoms subsiding. The father of Stroud's house guest happened to be John Schieffelin, an infectious disease expert John Schieffelin at Tulane University. He suggested the family was experiencing carbon monoxide poisoning, but Stroud was initially dismissive. Doctors had never mentioned the possibility, and she had a carbon monoxide detector. But to be sure, she bought a portable detector the next morning. It sounded immediately after she put the batteries in and turned it on. She soon realized that her other detector didn't detect carbon monoxide as she'd thought. Tests at the scene showed that everyone in the house had elevated levels of the gas in their systems. Luckily, no one needed medical treatment and everyone recovered quickly. Firefighters discovered that the source of the leak was a loose furnace clamp, and it was quickly repaired. Stroud installed multiple carbon monoxide detectors in her home after the incident. She took the story to the Washington Post at the urging of her doctor, who encouraged her to warn other families about the dangers of the clear, odorless gas. 1. Massive facial swelling. One morning in 2019, 56-year-old Filipino carpenter Romulo Pilapil woke up with itchy eyes and a runny nose. He received medication for what seemed like a conventional case of sinusitis, but 2 weeks went by with no improvement in his condition. His face swelled up like a balloon, leaving medical professionals on the island of Leyte baffled. They recommended traveling to Manila for treatment, but Pilapil's family couldn't afford it. His eyes eventually swelled shut and he had to stop working. Pilapil's wife worked as a street sweeper. His kids put studying on the back burner and took jobs to help support the family while also picking up the slack at home. They also became their father's caretakers. With no foreseeable ability for better medical care, Pilapil had no choice but to live with his debilitating condition. There have been no updates since the story first made international headlines, and it's unclear whether he ever accessed the treatment he needed or received a diagnosis.
Would you rather be the sole witness to a crime that was committed by a corrupt cop who was determined not to lose his job, or the only witness to a mob-related shooting? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.